Well, we truly do live in very strange times. That expression and saying things like that seems to be just so much more common, doesn't it? When you're engaged in a conversation with someone, it always seems to come up. Boy, we're living in strange times. And don't want to overuse the phrase, but I have an example of how strange of a time that we are living in. The last few months, the job market there's been some strange behaviors. There was in September, I believe it was, in the United States, about 4.5 million people that quit their jobs, and the month before that, it was about the same. It was about 4 million people have resigned, have quit their jobs. Some of them are just looking for a different kind of job. It was mainly jobs in the sectors of education, teachers, healthcare, the restaurant sector of our economy. There's a lot of reasons out there. I'm not going to get into exploring all of those reasons. That's not really the point of me bringing it up. There's a lot of reasons, a lot of causes, a lot of theories on why this is. There's also the politicizing of that as well. The Democrats will say that it's this, and the Republicans will say it's that. We're not going to get into that. The point is, there are people that are quitting. They're quitting. They're resigning. I want you to open your Bibles to the book of Galatians. That's exactly what Paul says in the 4th chapter, Galatians chapter 4, verse 8. He is telling believers in these churches of Galatia that they do not need to quit. Do not quit. Do not resign. You have been converted, and now after you've been converted, don't go back and convert to something else. It's a shame that they would hear the gospel. He brought this up earlier in the book about do not turn away from the gospel. And so now he comes back to that same idea once again. Don't turn back. Don't quit. Let's read our text together as we begin at verse 8 of Galatians chapter 4. Galatians chapter 4, beginning at verse 8. Howbeit then, when you knew not God, you did service unto them which by nature are no gods. But now, after that you have known God, or rather are known of God, how turn you again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto you desire again to be in bondage? You observe days and months and times and years. I am afraid of you, lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain. The Apostle Paul is exploring this before and after status. He is reminding them that they have been converted. He is reminding them of what they were before they heard the gospel, and then he is reminding them of who they truly are now. You see that very clearly right there in verses 8 and 9. Verses 8 and 9 are a contrasting idea. He says there, howbeit then, when you knew not God, but they know God now. So he's talking about their prior to their conversion. Notice in verse 9, he says, but now. And so he's talking about the present tense. This is who you are now. This is what you were, and this is what you are now. And so they were not in a relationship with God, and then they are in a relationship with God after they have heard the gospel. And what he's doing here is he's talking about, he calls them these beggarly elements, these weak and beggarly elements. You see that at the latter part of verse 9. And what he's doing here, he's trying to encourage them and exhort them to move past their little infatuation. You know, people get infatuated with things, don't they? I know you've had a teacher, and I've known teachers, and where they have a hobby horse. They get up there and they're teaching math, and then next thing you know, they're teaching the same thing they always do. They go back to this little hobby horse. Maybe it's an illustration they like. Maybe it's a history teacher, and they just get hung up on Greek history. It's just what they like to talk about. Don't you just love teachers like that? That's sarcastic. They just are infatuated with it. They're obsessed with it. It's what they like to talk about. The people of Galatia have become infatuated with the teaching of the Judaizers, and they believe somehow that it's very important for them to observe the law. And this is their new God. This is their new idol. What he is saying here is that you were, before you were converted, you were, and you didn't know God, you were worshiping these idols. And now that you have been converted, it's very strange to me, Paul says, that now you would become infatuated and obsessed with these weaker and these beggarly and these lower things that really don't have any room in the service of God. There are more important things to be infatuated with than these things, these earthly things. This is the same word that we saw last week. It's the stoicheia. It is the elements. It is these earthly elements. I reminded you that this little phrase is used also in the book of Colossians. And it's talking about these basic things of the world. Air, fire, these basic elements, these basic principles. And now he's saying, you're going back to these basic principles. This thing of law and all of these things. Let me tell you what they should be infatuated with, and they're not. It's Jesus. Jesus is not at the top of their priorities. How many times that there's been a comment made by someone or a decision made by someone in a church body or in the realm of so-called serving God in one of the Lord's churches, and you just scratch your head and you wonder, where is the Spirit of Jesus in that comment or that decision? Where was Jesus when that was said? Where was Jesus when you decided that this was going to take priority? Where does Jesus, what place does He take in your heart? Some people have put Him in the back seat when He needs to be in the front seat. And that's what the Apostle Paul is talking about here. When you are lost, hey, I can understand it. But here's why I'm scratching my head. Because you're saved. Or you say you are. But where's Jesus? You've got Him not just in the back seat, you've got Him riding in the trailer. You're pulling the truck, you're pulling a trailer with your truck, and He's in the back. He's not even in the front anymore. Where's Jesus in this? Notice what he says here in this first verse of our text in verse 8. He says, you were enslaved to false gods. Notice this in verse 8. Howbeit then, when you knew not God, you did service unto them which by nature are no gods. And so he's talking about their prior status of not knowing God, of being estranged from God, in rebellion, in alienation from God. Let me just put it to you this way. I've heard people say, we don't hear enough about preaching about hell. We don't hear enough about preaching about sin. I'm going to tell you that hell is real and sin is the real problem. Sin is the problem, and there is no relationship with God apart from Jesus Christ. He is saying you were infatuated, you were in love and obsessed with all of these things when you did not know God. Dear friend, there is not almost being a child of God. You are either a child of God or you are lost. You won't be a child of God, you won't come into relationship with God by following His commands. You say, well, I thought we did. No, you come into relationship with God by believing and trusting in Jesus Christ. He paid a price, and it wasn't for nothing. He paid the price so that you could live. It's not because you're a good little boy or a good little girl and you have earned your way into heaven. It's not by following the commands. It's because you placed your faith and trust in Jesus Christ, and one day you were saved. And a specific point. Notice in verses 8 and 9, he is talking about a specific point in time. He said, you were, and then he says, but now. Notice in verse 9, he says, but now, after that you have known God, I have come into relationship with God. And by the way, this word know, it is the term for a very intimate relationship. It is a very close relationship. It is the same word that's used of the kind of relationship between a husband and a wife. Knowing all about each other. It is not, I've been saying this, I don't know why, I've had a hobby horse the last 2 or 3 weeks about talking about the abstract or theoretical versus the concrete. I think there's a lot of people that are religious people and they want to talk about God and they want to talk about what they believe about God, but they don't really live out the life in a concrete expression of what they say about God. They say they live for Christ, but do they really live for Christ? That's up between you and God. And what my question is this, and you need to ask yourself this question, then how do I do that? What does it look like? What evidence would you provide? Again, that's something you'll have to answer to God about, not me. But that's just a great question, isn't it? It's a great reflection. What evidence is there in my life that I actually live for Christ? I eat black-eyed peas on the first. What is it? I go to church every Sunday morning. I don't cuss. I don't drink. I don't do this. I don't cheat on my. What is it? What is the concrete expression of your faith? That's a tough question, isn't it? It shouldn't be too hard, but it's a good one to ask. He says, but now, in the present tense, here you are now, Galatians. Here you are now, and you have come into, look at verse 9. But now, after that you have known God. And then he quickly pivots and reminds them that, or rather are known by God. Do you see that there? That's a very, very important pivot. Because what it reminds us of is that our relationship with God is not based upon something just that we have done. If it was based on that, then you could have just invented God. Mankind didn't invent God. God made Himself known to humanity, and you were saved because God made Himself known to you first. Do you believe the text that we love Him because He first loved us? That's almost parallel, almost synonymous with what he is saying here. I came into relationship with Him. I came into deep knowledge of a relationship with Jesus because He made Himself known to me. Not because I did something and I get a pat on the back and a trophy and a medal and everybody stands up and claps for me. That's not what salvation is about. Salvation is about God revealing Himself to you, and you responded in faith and trust in His provision for your sin. That provision, provide, is Jesus. First thing I want to give you this evening is this, is that God's grace is the basis for one's deep knowledge of Him, and it marks a break from the past of serving false gods. That's what I want you to know tonight. That's the main thing that I want you to take with you tonight. This is what these 4 verses are all about. It's about God's grace. You know where God's grace comes into play? When God made Himself known to you. Do you realize that we have a God who is mighty, who is sovereign, who is all-knowing, and He didn't have to do anything. with His own creation. But let me tell you about the wonderful grace of God. You want to talk about grace? Let's talk about grace. The grace of God, a part of it is that He loved you and made known, here is a way that you can come into relationship with me. That's God's grace. That's a gracious act of God. Knocking on the door of your heart and saying, dear friend, I am here. I have provided for you. That's the grace of God. God's grace is the premise. It's the foundation. Then we come into relationship with Him, and I grow. And I become more intimately aware of His love for me. You don't have everything and all the knowledge that you may have as compared to when you initially believed. You follow me? When you initially believed, and you can all probably go back to that time and you say, you know what, I didn't know a lot, but I knew one thing, God was speaking to my heart. And you know what? That's the only thing that matters at that point. Because after that, then you come into deeper knowledge of Him. We call it, the New Testament phrase is growing in grace and knowledge of the Lord. The Apostle Paul repeats that throughout the New Testament, that his prayer for many believers is that they grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord. And so we don't know everything, but God's grace is the basis for it. He loves us. And then it is that point that marks a break. It is a turning point in our life. And we move past and we turn our back. This is what the word conversion is all about. I was converted. I converted from serving idols, and now I am serving a living God. It is not something that is dead and that is made of wood or made of stone. I am serving the true and living God. Watch what he does here. Then he says in verse 9, he asks this question, then how are you turning again? How are you say you've been converted. Do you see what he's doing here? It's almost like a play on words, isn't it? You have been converted, but now why are you converting back? That's what he's saying. You've turned away from these things, then why are you turning back again? Why are you going back to this? A while ago I was talking about the infatuated with the inferior things of religion. You know, you can be a very religious person and be totally off track, and your focus is not on the Lord. You can be very religious. We've been going through the Gospel of Matthew. In the Gospel of Matthew, you're going to see next week in chapter 15 that Jesus is confronted by some very, very religious people. And I'll dare say that there's not one in here tonight that would not it would be a sobering experience to have company with a Pharisee. They were by the book. They were very, very strict in their customs. They made it a point to be right. But you can be right all day long on religion and ritual, and if you're wrong about Jesus, then you're wrong altogether. I can train a lot of people to have good behavior. We can get good behavior. But what Jesus is looking for is not just good behavior. He's looking for good behavior, okay? But He's also looking for a change of heart. And that's what He's talking about here in this. He says, how have you turned away? Look what you're turning towards. You're turning towards these weak and beggarly elements. Same word, and I already told you this a while ago, the stoicheia. It is these basic things, air and water and fire, these earthly things. And he's talking about these rituals of religion. He says, whereunto you desire again to be in bondage. the observing of not eating certain meats, of circumcision, of observing different days and years and Sabbaths. In fact, that's what he says here in verse 10. He's talking about, in verse 10, he gives an example. He says, you observe days and months and times and years. Not being, none of us here, I don't believe, used to be practicing Judaism. But you probably know enough about the Old Testament to follow me on this, is that he's talking about things like the Sabbath. He's talking about things like the year of Jubilee. He's talking about things like the new moons. He's talking about these feast days that they would have, and they would observe them for sometimes a week or two. All of these things that had to do with Judaism and the law. I want to tell you this, and what they're supposed to be learning, if they haven't already learned it, is that Jesus fulfilled all of these things. So why are they so infatuated with it when really their focus shouldn't be on the thing that preceded the fulfillment, but they should be focused on the fulfillment, and they should be focused on Jesus. Jesus is the big thing. Jesus was the object. Jesus was the prize of what all these little things were pointing to. Why are you worshiping the pointer and not the object of which they pointed to? Do you follow me? And so he says here in verse 11, as he closes, he says, I am afraid. He's not afraid of them, but he is afraid for them. It would be like this, just a little turn of a phrase that you might be able to relate to. He's probably saying something like this: dear friend, you're skating on thin ice. He is saying that I am deeply concerned with your focus and infatuation on these things that were pointing to Christ when you really need to be focused on Christ Himself. Notice here, he says, lest I have bestowed upon you labor in vain. This word vain, it means empty. It means lacking purpose. It means senseless, just not really with an end goal in mind. And so he is fearing that his ministry to them has been without purpose, has been a waste. It has been senseless. What I noticed here is that this fear that he shares with them, it implies a decision, doesn't it? If someone said that to you, you would be thinking, well, I guess I need to decide. I need to get off the fence, and I need to make a decision. And it does imply a decision. The Galatian people need to determine, what am I really focused on? What is important to me? Am I infatuated with these things? Is my focus really on Christ? He says, I'm afraid for you, lest I have brought to you something and labored with you for nothing. What will they do with their relationship with Christ? Here's two options. Turn away like they have. He says, how do you turn away? How do you turn away? Go back to chapter 1 real quick. Look at verse 6. This was the beginning of the letter. This is what this letter is about. He says, I marvel, or I'm astonished. And you can pick up on the same tone here in chapter 4. How do you turn? I'm in disbelief. I'm at a loss of words. How could you turn away from what you've already been converted from? He says in verse 6, I marvel that you are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel. And then, he goes on and says there's really not another gospel, but you've turned away from the gospel. Notice here in verse 11, once again, he leaves them with a choice. Turn away from the sufficiency of the finished work of Christ, or may they cling to the cross as your basis and your focus of your relationship with God. That's really all he gives us. He's really not sugarcoating it. He's really not saying that, well, I've got about 5 options for you. Really, there's only 2. You either cling to Christ or you turn away. What are they going to do? You know, as Paul speaks here in terms of this futility in verse 11, in vain, the lack of purpose, this emptiness of one's conversion from false gods into a relationship with God through the cross of Christ. Let me ask you a question. What is the focus of your conversion? Why are you here? What does salvation mean to you? Here's another question, and maybe even a better question. What are you going to do with your salvation? How are you going to serve? Are you going to serve God's way? Are you going to serve with Jesus as the sole focus of your life? Or will it be other stuff? You know, a lot of people get involved in church because they like the games that are played in church. They like it. They like church games. They like the procedures. But I ask you, are you in love with church or are you in love with Christ? There's a big difference. I guarantee you, I'd rather go to church with a lot of people that didn't know how to have church as long as their focus was on Christ. I don't care how long their hair is, how many earrings they got, how many tattoos they got. I guarantee you I'd rather go to church with a lot of real people than a bunch of hypocrites that know how to play church. I'm not accusing anyone of that in here. I'm just telling you, it's better to be real and genuine and follow Christ and know who you are and appreciate the grace of God than it is to be a religious champion. Religious champions, there's a lot of religious champions in hell because they really never gave their heart to Christ. They gave their heart to religion. Let's pray. Our Father, we thank you so much for the grace that you've given us, a Son that you gave on the cross to die for our sins.